Hey guys, this is Mr. Coley. We've learned a lot about cells. We learned about the organelles within cells. We learned how cells get things in and out of them across the membrane. But we haven't really talked a lot about how cells really replicate or divide. Because remember that we are an organism that has been composed of 100 trillion cells, yet we started from one cell. So how did we get there? How did we go from one cell to 100 trillion cells? So this lecture is going to be about how that happens. And the way that happens is actually called the cell cycle. So just like many processes in biology, we have what's called a cycle or a circle or something like that. So here we have the cell cycle, and we'll go through all the stages of the cell cycle. But as you can see, like many cycles and other processes in biology and in science in general, in the natural world, it repeats. Kind of like a circle, or like a circle of biology, or a circle of life. Sorry, not that circle of life, but you get the point. It's going to be a process that repeats over and over and over again. All right, so let's get started. So we have to ask the questions of why do cells divide? What are the purposes of cell division? And this is going to be very important because there are many different processes for which cells divide. So the first process being to reproduce. And so we talked about this when we were learning about eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. And we talked about reproduction, and I know some of you guys are probably remembering that, but we remember that reproduction of prokaryotic cells, or some eukaryotic cells, happens in single-celled organisms. So if I have one cell, and then I divide into two cells, then my single-celled organisms have essentially reproduced. So remember that in prokaryotic cells, this is called binary fission. And in eukaryotic cells, we talk about that as being mitosis, which we're going to learn. There's going to be a whole separate PowerPoint on mitosis because it's a super important stage for the cells and all cells. We also do it to repair. So when organisms have cells that are damaged or dead, then we need to repair those, or the organism would just kind of fall apart. So think about, we replace our old cells. So think about our skin cells. If you really look at your skin and you really think about the skin that you're actually touching on the very top, that's all dead skin. I don't know if you remember, but we were talking about, like, way back when we were talking about evolution, and we watched that one video where they had, like, the frog skin under the microscope, and they compared that to the reptile skin, and the frog skin was, like, super smooth because that whole top layer was alive, which is one of the reasons why you really shouldn't, like, hold frogs or fish, for that matter. Because like the skin cells on the top or the surface of the frog are alive. And then they looked at the reptile skin, and you could see like all of those like big crusty layers on top, which was all the dead skin, which became the reptile's scales. And that's all dead. So we're kind of the same way. I mean, we don't really technically have scales, but we do have a layer of dead skin on top. So that means that our skin cells are constantly dying and needing to be replaced. And then, of course, this beautiful picture of a snake shedding its skin. So the same concept of that dead skin layer on top being replaced by new cells. And then, of course, the most common reason for many multicellular organisms, such as ourselves, snakes, as you see there, trees, anything that is macroscopic, right, so that we're seeing with the naked eye, they need to do that to grow. So remember, we all start as one single cell. And, of course, what is a slideshow without elephants. And you can see that little guy down there obviously has a lot of growing to do to get to be the size of his mom, right? So those are some of the reasons, the main primary reasons why cells divide. Okay, so there are 3 major stages of the cell cycle. And then those are going to be, again, there's our beautiful cell cycle pictures. You can see that going all the way around the cell. We have interphase, which is going to be the longest phase of the cell cycle. And then we have mitosis. And then last but not least, cytokinesis. So that's a really fancy word. Remember that anytime you see the word cyto, that means cell, and kinesis in this case is kind of like splitting. So the cell is actually going to divide during cytokinesis. It's mitosis and cytokinesis are very much entangled with each other, but it's just a matter of semantics. And you don't need to write this part down on the bottom in the blue box, but it's kind of interesting to note that cell division can be as fast as 30 minutes, such in some bacteria. So we talked about why bacteria can spread so rapidly, because they're dividing every 30 minutes, and then that's their size increases exponentially. So that's kind of crazy. And then in other cells, you might never see cell division. So once we're born, we have all of these cells, muscle cells, fat cells, nerve cells. We don't get any more cells. There's no more division after we're born, after we've developed of muscle, fat, or nerve cells. They're basically the same. And so you're like thinking, well, how can I get stronger? Like, how do my muscles get bigger then? The muscle cell itself can elongate and widen, but it can't, you can't divide, so you're not going to get more muscle cells. And that kind of makes sense, because then your arm might get really weird looking, because if the cells keep dividing, then your one arm might be longer than your other arm, and then that would be kind of a weird thing. And the same is true for nerve cells. Nerve cells we talk about that a little bit when we were talking about endo and exocytosis, the neurotransmitters being released, to communicate between nerve cells. And we talked about the fact that really from your toes all the way up to your brain, you might only have about 3 or 4 connections. So 3 or 4 different cells connected between your toes and your brain. Now, of course, there's millions of them lined up next to each other, but that connection takes a really long time. So if a nerve cell becomes damaged or dies, there's no way for it to grow its little feelers called the axon all the way down straight so that it reconnects. That's why it's so crazy when people break their neck or their back. A lot of times those nerves can't regrow across that break. So that's what causes paralysis. So either, if you lose the loss of your legs, you're a paraplegic, and if you lose the loss of, all 4 arms, you're the quadriplegic, right? So para to pair of pants or pair of shoes, it's 2, right? Or quad being 4, so you can't use your arms or your legs. And it's also really interesting that fat cells never divide either. So we have dedicated cells that are kind of like the storage cells in our body. And remember, fats are really just the stored energy of stuff that we ate that we weren't using right away. So our body's like, I'll save this away for later. And so they stuff it away in these fat cells. So everyone is born with different numbers of fat cells, but what determines if you get fat or not is the amount of stuff that's stored in each one of those cells. So a really popular thing in the 90s, and I don't know if it's nearly as popular anymore, was to get liposuction. And so people would actually go into surgery, and doctors would really just vacuum up a lot of the fat cells that they could see. And then, that way, you're like, oh, hey, I'm not fat anymore. But it was funny because the fat cells just that are left continue to store the fat. So it's kind of a moot point. All right, so interphase. Interphase is going to be the longest phase of the cell cycle. So it's really most of the cell's life, or so to speak, or the life cycle, so to speak, exists within interphase. So this is basically when everything is happening in the cell. It's interesting to note that the DNA is going to be uncoiled at this point. We're going to talk a lot about DNA when we get to mitosis, which will be in a future lecture. So you can look down at that picture at the bottom right, and you have the nucleus, right, and the DNA, so all those squiggly purple lines is the uncoiled DNA. The DNA is uncoiled because it's being used, right? So when we think back to the video we watched on the Our Secret Universe, you have all of those little proteins inside the cell, and they're working really hard to copy segments of DNA to make RNA, which then makes proteins, and then those proteins carry out all of life's functions. So the cell is very busy at this point. So there's three main phases or stages of interphase. And so we have gap 1, which we always so call G1. That's an easy way to remember that. And then we have synthesis, which is S. So synthesis, if you are like synthesizing, you are making something. And then you have gap 2, or G2. And again, there's our beautiful cell cycle. So you can see this here, and then we're going to go through each one of these stages, gap 1, synthesis, and then gap 2 today. And they're nicely color-coded for you. All right, so gap 1, or G1. So this is going to be where cell growth happens. So if you're looking at the cycle as being complete, this cell has just come out of a division event, so it's fairly small compared to a mature cell. So you have cell growth, so the cell is going to get bigger. And at this point, you're going to have your organelles replicate. So if you look at this cell, you have your purple nucleus in the middle. And then let's just pretend those orange squares are mitochondria, and let's say the green is, I don't know, endoplasmic reticulum or something like that. So what's going to happen is the cell is going to grow and replicate its organelles. So see, now it has more organelles, it got bigger. That's basically the gist of G1. I'll give you guys a couple times. I think that it would be a really good idea for you guys to draw this in your notes, because it kind of shows how, like, you have a small circle and it gets a bigger circle, because then you really understand that in gap 1 the main purpose is really to grow and replicate the organelles. So apparently I'll give you some time to do that. Make your artistic endeavors as excellent as you need to. Unofficially, gap 1 is probably the longest part of interphase as well, because the cell is basically building itself back up. If you think about it in terms of, I don't know, for those guys who play, or girls who play Clash of Clans, it's like right after your base gets completely leveled, and so you log back in and it's all like smashed, and then it takes some time to grow back up, and then before you can harvest elixir and coins and all that kind of stuff. Obviously the cell hasn't been smashed during cytokinesis, but it's definitely been ripped apart, ripped in two, literally, and it needs to repair from that. All right, so gap 1, that is gap 1. All right, so then there is synthesis. So synthesis, or S phase, this is going to be where your DNA is copied. Okay, so think about synthesis as you are making copies of DNA, so synthesizing copies of DNA. And this is probably something that you'll want to draw too. Just draw one double helix and then an arrow, and then you're going to have two double helixes afterwards, symbolizing that the DNA is going to be copied with our copy machine here. Cool animation, and which results in two complete sets of all of our DNA. And this is super important because it's kind of like, if you forget to copy part of your DNA, then you're going to have big problems in the cell that ends up with the short end of the stick, so to speak. It's kind of like trying to build a really super complicated Lego set, maybe, I don't know. And you are missing like 10 pages of the instructions. It might turn out somewhat the same, but probably not how it was intended to be. So it's really important that synthesis occurs and that it occurs correctly. And then we have gap 2. So gap 2 is a fairly small phase in interphase, and then that is going to be just a little bit right before mitosis. So you have your cell, gap 2, or your cell in gap 2 phase, and you're just going to have some additional growth here. The cell is finally, a mature cell. It's replicated its DNA, so it's ready for it's prepared to separate the DNA into two bunches, and then but it does need a little bit more growth just to prepare for mitosis. So then you have, it's not an appreciable difference, but you do have a somewhat larger cell. Okay. So these are the 3 stages of interphase, and it's really important that you have interphase down, because that's kind of the easy part. So G1, S, G2. I don't know a good acronym for that. I mean, that might be something that you guys can come up with on your own. It could be like green snakes grow, or gosh, I don't even know what to do anymore. But that's kind of what interphase is. So tomorrow what we'll do is we'll go through the stages of mitosis, and that might be, and then we can put that all together. All right? Enjoy.